The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, David Whitfield had stopped opening his mail altogether. It sat there on the kitchen counter of his mother's house, a small stack of white envelopes with red stamped warnings, each one a little louder than the last, while outside, the for sale sign creaked gently on its post in the October wind. David hadn't wanted to put that sign up. He'd fought it for 3 months, telling himself there was another way, some version of this story where he didn't have to stand in this driveway and watch his childhood disappear into someone else's mortgage. But there wasn't another way. Not anymore. Not after the business partner he'd trusted for 11 years had emptied the company accounts and vanished to Belize, leaving David holding $400,000 of debt that had his name on every line. Bankruptcy had taken the rest. This house, his mother's house, the one thing she'd left him free and clear when she died 2 years ago, was the only thing untouched by the lawyers because it had been in a trust, and trusts, it turned out, moved slower than creditors. But the buyers were coming today at 2 o'clock, a young couple named the Ashfords, and once their check cleared, there would be nothing left of Eleanor Whitfield in David's life except memory. He stood in the kitchen at 1:40, coffee going cold in his hand, and thought about the last conversation he'd had with his mother before the cancer took the last of her strength to speak. She'd been thin by then, swallowed by the hospital bed they'd set up in the living room, but her eyes had still been sharp, still hers. "David," she'd said, gripping his hand with more force than her body should have had left in it. "If you're ever lost, if you ever don't know where to turn or who to turn to, you go to my room. My space. Upstairs. You sit in my chair and you do exactly what I used to do there. You'll understand when the time comes." He'd nodded and told her he loved her and thought at the time that it was the kind of thing dying people said, sentimental, symbolic, not literal. He hadn't gone up to that room once since the funeral. It felt like trespassing on something that wasn't his to disturb. But it was 1:42 now, and the Ashfords would be here in 18 minutes, and David Whitfield had nowhere left to put the particular, grinding panic that had been living in his chest for the better part of a year. So he climbed the stairs. His mother's room was exactly as she'd left it. His aunt had helped him close it up after the funeral, out of some unspoken agreement that this one room, at least, didn't need to be touched yet. The air smelled like her, still, faintly, lavender and old paper and the specific mustiness of a house that had settled into itself over 40 years. A worn green armchair sat by the window, angled toward the light the way it had been positioned since before David was born. Beside it, a small side table held a cold, empty coffee cup that had been there so long David wasn't sure if it was the same one from her final week, or if someone had simply put a new one there out of habit and never taken it away. He sat in the chair. It gave a little under him, the cushion long since molded to a smaller frame than his own, and for a moment he just sat there, feeling foolish, feeling like a grown man playing dress-up in his dead mother's grief. Do what I used to do there. What had she done there? He tried to remember. Mornings, mostly. She'd get up before the rest of the house, before David's father had died, before David himself had grown and left and come back changed by failure. She'd bring her coffee up here and read the newspaper, cover to cover, in the hour before anyone else woke. It was, she'd always said, the only part of the day that belonged entirely to her. There was no coffee to drink now, and no fresh newspaper. But there, folded on the small table beside the chair, was an old copy of the Tribune, yellowed at the edges, dated 18 months before her death. David picked it up simply because it was there, because some part of him needed his hands to be doing something other than shaking. He opened it and started to read. Not because he cared about 18-month-old stories, about zoning disputes, and high school football scores, but because it was the closest thing to sitting beside her he had left. His eyes moved over the print without absorbing much of it, his mind circling the same $400,000, the same betrayal, the same sign in the yard downstairs. He read anyway, for her, because she'd asked him to, and it was the last thing she'd ever asked. He'd made it through most of the front section when he heard a car door close outside, and then a man's voice, cheerful, unhurried, calling up toward the house. "David? You in there? Ashfords are here." His stomach dropped. He set the newspaper down on the side table a little too quickly and stood. The paper slid off the edge of the table as he moved past it, fanning open as it hit the floor, pages separating from each other in a way old newsprint does, brittle, unwilling to stay bound together after enough years of sitting folded in the same shape. David bent to gather it up before someone downstairs wondered why he'd left his mother's room in disarray, and that was when he saw it. Tucked between two inner pages, where it must have rested undisturbed since the day his mother placed it there, was a small envelope. Not one of the bank's angry white rectangles, but a cream-colored one, soft with age, his name written across the front in his mother's looping cursive. The same hand that used to sign his school permission slips, the same hand that had written "I love you," always on birthday cards for 34 years. He didn't move for a long moment. Downstairs, he could hear the Ashfords' voices now. The realtors, too. All of them making the small, pleasant noises of people about to buy a house, unaware that history was rearranging itself 6 feet above their heads. His fingers weren't steady when he opened it. Inside was a single folded letter and a document, a bank statement he realized from an account he had never known existed. An account in his name, opened 9 years earlier, funded slowly and quietly, month after month, in amounts too modest to notice against the ordinary shape of a retired schoolteacher's life. The balance at the bottom of the page made his breath catch in his throat. $386,000. The letter, in his mother's handwriting, was short. "David, if you're reading this, you found your way back to my chair, which means you needed it, which means I was right to leave this here instead of somewhere a lawyer could find and complicate. I always knew you'd chase something bigger than yourself one day, and I always knew there was a chance it would cost you more than you expected. This isn't much, but it's yours, quietly, the way I built it. Don't sell this house to survive, sweetheart. Sell it because you're ready to, not because you have no other choice. You always have another choice. You just have to sit still long enough to find it. I love you always. Mom." David sat back down in the chair, the letter shaking gently in his hands, and for the first time in 11 months, he let himself cry without trying to stop it. Downstairs, the realtor called his name again, more insistently now. David wiped his face, folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, and stood. He walked to the top of the stairs, looked down at the small gathering of strangers waiting in his mother's front hall to take her house away from him, and, for the first time in a long while, felt something other than dread. "I'll be right down," he called. "There's just been a change of plans." He came down the stairs slowly, the envelope still warm in his hand, and found the Ashfords standing in the front hall with the realtor, all 3 of them smiling the polite, expectant smiles of people who believed this was already settled. "David, hi," the realtor said, glancing at her watch. "We were starting to wonder. Shall we go over the closing paperwork?" "There isn't going to be a closing," David said. The smiles faltered. The realtors went first, then the husbands, then the wives, in that order, like a wave losing its energy against the shore. "I'm sorry," the realtor said. "I'm not selling the house." David's voice surprised him. Steady, certain, Nothing like the man who had climbed those stairs 18 minutes earlier. I appreciate you all coming out. I do. But I've changed my mind. The husband, Mr. Ashford, stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. David, listen, I understand cold feet. Believe me, we went through the same thing with our first place. But we really love this house. What if we came up on the offer? We could go to 490, maybe even 5, if that makes this easier. It was more money than David had let himself imagine when the sign first went into the yard. 6 months ago, an offer like that would have felt like rescue. Today it felt like nothing at all, a number without weight, because for the first time in nearly a year, David didn't need rescuing. It's not about the money, he said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. This house isn't for sale. I'm sorry for the trouble. There was a short, awkward silence, the kind that follows any door closing somewhere a person had expected it to stay open. But the Ashfords were decent people, and after a moment Mrs. Ashford simply nodded and said she hoped he'd found what he needed. The realtor, less pleased, gathered her folder of paperwork and reminded David there would be a small fee for the broken listing, which he agreed to without argument. Within a few minutes, the driveway was empty again. The for sale sign the only thing left standing where the Ashford's car had been. David pulled it out of the ground himself that same afternoon, snapping the little wire legs and carrying it to the garage, where it would sit for years forgotten behind paint cans and a lawnmower his mother had never once let him touch without asking first. The money did what money like that is supposed to do when it's spent carefully instead of desperately. David paid off the remaining creditors who hadn't been fully discharged in the bankruptcy, cleared the last of the legal fees that had been quietly compounding for over a year, and set aside enough to start again, smaller this time, more careful, a modest consulting business built on the kind of caution that only comes from having lost everything once already. He kept the house. He kept the room upstairs exactly as it was, green armchair and all. And some mornings when he couldn't sleep, he still went up there with a cup of coffee and sat in his mother's chair, not because he was lost anymore, but because it was simply a good place to start the day. 3 years later, David Whitfield was debt-free, steady on his feet again, and happier in the quiet, unremarkable way that follows real hardship than he had been in a very long time. And every October, when the leaves outside his mother's window turned gold and started to fall, he thought of her voice, telling him he always had another choice, and he was grateful every single time that he'd finally learned to believe her.